During the night, unidentified objects flew into Polish airspace over the Podlaskie voivodeship from Belarus. Most likely, it was another series of balloons. According to the Armed Forces Operational Command, restrictions were imposed on civil air traffic because of the potential threat. Our findings indicate that there were about 20 balloons. Military statements are reassuring and claim that there was no threat, but the scale of this phenomenon is worrying. Military systems reacted quickly and correctly. They immediately detected unidentified objects that flew into Polish airspace from Belarus. The flight of all objects was continuously monitored by the military radar systems of the Polish Armed Forces. This is an excerpt from a statement by the Armed Forces Operational Command. It also states that the military was not sure what specific objects they were dealing with. Based on the analyses carried out, including the flight characteristics, speed and direction of movement of the objects, it was assessed that they were most likely balloon-like objects moving in accordance with meteorological conditions. No threat to the security of the airspace of the Republic of Poland was found. And here is another inaccuracy, because the next part of the statement indicates that at the time the objects were detected, a threat could not be ruled out. In order to ensure safety, temporary restrictions were imposed on the use of part of the airspace over the Podlaskie province for civil traffic. And although the Armed Forces Operational Command assures us that it is in constant contact with other services and that information is being exchanged with them, Belarusian balloons are still flying into our airspace without any obstacles. It is embarrassing that there has been no decisive response from the Polish services, from Donald Tusk's government, from the December 13th coalition. This is ruining Poland's position on the international stage, because how can such practices be allowed? It's embarrassing. Poland has anti-drone systems purchased by the previous government. Their use could send a clear signal to our enemies that Poland is effectively guarding its borders. They should be shot down. The Polish army has the appropriate weapons to shoot them down. There are anti-drone systems, so these drones can also be neutralized without shooting them down. The border guard has the appropriate tools. Why is nothing being done about this? This is a fundamental question that should be asked of those in power. Those in power are either unable or unwilling to act. Witold Zębaczyński, from the December 13th coalition, as a member of the National Defence Committee, argues that although the government is aware that further violations of our border are part of hybrid war against Poland, the best response is no response. There is a game going on about how we are able to identify these objects and classify the potential threat they pose without having to resort to our highest air reconnaissance and defence capabilities. Interestingly, when 2 Belarusian helicopters flew into Polish airspace in 2023 during the Law and Justice government, Radosław Sikorski was outraged that they were not shot down. I believe that Russian rockets and armed Belarusian helicopters violating Polish airspace should be shot down. Provided that the debris falls on our territory, we are within our rights. It is better for Lukashenko to understand preventatively that NATO is not to be trifled with. At that time, however, it was an isolated incident. Now balloons from Belarus fly into our territory not infrequently. The last such incident took place less than 2 weeks ago, on the night of January the 16th. According to our information, more than 50 balloons flew in at that time. A day later, the Near Zalezhne portal, based on information from the border guard, reported another 16 balloons. We received information that there were balloons in the air, which is why we published the article. In the afternoon, however, the border guard denied this information, although this map shows that the planes were avoiding eastern Poland at that time. Later, it was unofficially revealed that the balloons were indeed near the Polish border. It was probably the weather that caused the balloons to turn back from Polish airspace to Belarus, which was finally confirmed by the authorities the next day. The Białystok branch of TVP, which is in liquidation, also contributed to the chaos of information. Although one of the balloons fell in the parking lot next to the station's headquarters, its employees did not consider this to be particularly important information. The police reported the detection of 2 balloons, allegedly smuggling cigarettes. The objects that violated the airspace are smuggling balloons. The services are securing the remains of the balloons along with illegal packages of cigarettes without excise duty after the approximate location was indicated by the Armed Forces Operational Command. Today, the border guard repeats a similar narrative. The first objects discovered are smuggling balloons. Activities are underway to determine the circumstances of the incident. Nearly 60 balloons also invaded Polish airspace on the night of Christmas Eve. In November, dangerous acts of sabotage took place on the railway tracks on the route from Warsaw to Ukraine, and in September, Poland was attacked by more than 20 drones. The pattern is the same. We want to see how Warsaw will react, how our allies in the European Union will react, and above all, how our NATO allies will react. Everything indicates that we must be prepared for further such incidents, because the government is not putting any pressure on Belarus, even though it could do so by blocking the railway border crossing, which is crucial for Belarus, Russia, and even China. Belarusian transport crosses our border with Belarus. This border with Belarus is the basis for such European Russian transport, and Chinese, where China is the sponsor and patron of the Russian Federation. That's 3 phone calls. That's 3 phone calls de facto, really. Of course, it will probably take a week or 2, because you would have to make this show of force and show that all the trucks are standing still, and someone is losing money. But 2 weeks of such actions and this hybrid fight from the border would be lost. However, the message is going out to the world, including to capitals hostile to us, that Poland is unable effectively to ensure the safety of its citizens. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we must answer the question of how our country should really react, whether such objects should be shot down, and whether we are prepared for such actions, because, ladies and gentlemen, the number of balloons is really symbolic. Today we must ask ourselves, among experts and politicians, whether we are prepared to neutralize even the number of objects that Kiev faces every second or third day. At this time, although there is no official information about how many balloons specifically flew into Poland last night, according to our information, there were about 20. It was a spectacular operation by the French services and a blow to the Russian Shadow Fleet, which, despite European sanctions, had been able to count on peace until now.
Okay, French Navy.
The captain, an Indian citizen, has been released, but the vessel will remain in France for the time being. This is the result of recent, very specific statements by the French president. We will not tolerate any violations. We are determined to comply with international law and ensure effective enforcement of sanctions. The activities of the Shadow Fleet contribute to the financing of aggression against Ukraine. It wasn't until last week that France began to take real action against the so-called Shadow Fleet, the illegal transport of Russian oil despite international sanctions. So, after almost 4 years of war in Ukraine, and after the Americans decided to take similar action, and after these recent words from the president of Ukraine,
why can't President Trump stop tankers from the Shadow Fleet and seize oil, but Europe doesn't? Russian oil is being transported right along European shores. That oil funds the war against Ukraine.
The Americans have so far detained a total of 7 tankers circumventing sanctions. In early January, there was a high-profile chase of a Russian ship flying a false flag that was sailing from Venezuela to Murmansk. The Bella 1 was detained despite Russian threats, and the US action was supported by, among others, the United Kingdom, which announced similar measures.
The vessel is part of an increasing web of shadow shipping that fuels and funds instability across the world, that undermines global trade, and that threatens our national security. We know Russia operates a vast shadow fleet of its own to bankroll its illegal invasion of Ukraine.
An important element in the fight against the Shadow Fleet has been the US operation in Venezuela, which not only changed the government of that country, but also dealt a heavy blow to the interests of Russia, Maduro's closest ally.
What's really changed is the dynamic that the Venezuelan interim authorities are now actually helping us identify Shadow Fleet ships that they want us to seize and feed into this new interim mechanism.
The Russians have threatened to send in their navy to protect their ships from being detained, but this is unlikely to happen. The Kremlin will most likely try to exploit the weakness and inconsistency of European countries. We will most likely see the continued operation of the Shadow Fleet, which currently numbers 1,000 ships, and at the same time detentions. This will allow the Russians to continue operating in individual countries to announce successes in combating such actions by the Russian side. The European Union does not have a common approach to the Shadow Fleet. Yesterday, the Spanish did not detain a Russian oil tanker that broke down at the entrance to the Strait of Gibraltar. The Spanish towed the vessel, which was sailing from Murmansk and was subject to European sanctions, to Morocco, where it was headed. Madrid has not explained why the ship was not detained or seized.
The Russian aggressor is not letting up.
Last night alone, the invaders fired 146 drones and an Iskander missile at Zaporizhia. Although more than 100 of them were shot down, 3 people were killed and several were injured. And this is Kiev, where a Russian drone struck a residential building. A young married couple was killed. My good friends were killed, and it's a little difficult for me to talk about it. Thank God their little daughter was sleeping on the first floor, and the neighbors were able to get her out of there right away. This war has been going on for almost 4 years, but the brutality of the Russians still manages to surprise us. Recently, missiles destroyed a civilian train. At least 5 people were killed. Ukraine is bleeding, but it is also painfully attacking its enemy, according to data from Kiev. Last night alone, more than 800 Russians were killed, and nearly 1,000 drones, 4 tanks, and 20 artillery systems were destroyed. The Russian army is currently advancing only about 70 meters per day, which is less than the Western Front moved during World War I. This is what border towns look like after weeks and sometimes long months of fighting. Experts predict that by spring, more than 2 million uniformed personnel on both sides of the front may be killed or wounded. However, there is a chance for peace, argues U.S. President Donald Trump.
We're looking at some very good things happening on Ukraine and Russia. Very good things. Very good things are happening on Ukraine and Russia.
This weekend, the second round of trilateral talks between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States is to take place in Abu Dhabi. The biggest point of contention is Russia's demand that Ukraine hand over the entire industrialized Donbass region. But the Kremlin's position is weakening, as evidenced by the fact that as a result of sanctions, Lukoil, Russia's second largest oil company, has had to abandon its global expansion plans and is planning to sell some of its assets, including refineries in Bulgaria and Romania. The residents of Kiev, a city where water and electricity are still a luxury, are particularly eager for positive results from the peace talks. We live in this building, and it is really cold in our apartment. There is almost no heating. There has been no water since Monday. It was only yesterday that they supplied us with cold water. It is really very difficult. War veterans are coming to the rescue, opening a mobile kitchen in one of the neighborhoods. It's about brotherhood, supporting each other, caring for each other. Now we are sharing this with the civilian population in order to reduce the distance between civilians and the military to some extent. Thanks to these efforts, this tin container and a few braziers have become a substitute for normality and home.
Officially, these are just exercises. However, the message is clear. American forces have arrived in the Middle East, taking part in the largest mobilization in this region in years. The aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln is to be the main tool of diplomacy through force. The American president is no longer playing by diplomatic conventions. Tension around Iran is rising rapidly again. Trump compared the current operation to previous actions against Venezuela and warned Tehran that if no agreement is reached, the consequences will be more serious than ever before. He explicitly mentioned the possibility of using force and a next attack, which he said will be much more severe.
And in June, we obliterated Iran's nuclear capacity in Operation Midnight Hammer. You saw that. People have been waiting for 22 years to do that, and we were right at the end. They were about a month away from having a nuclear weapon. We had to do it. And by the way, there's another beautiful armada floating beautifully toward Iran right now.
The administration in Washington emphasizes that the goal is not war, but to force Iran to return to negotiations and permanently block its nuclear program. In addition, it is crucial to stop the repression of civilians who are being murdered for opposing the policies of the Iranian regime.
In the thousands for certain.
And look, I think regimes, including that one in Iran, have learned that when you start shooting people in the head with snipers, it's effective. I mean, it works, and they've done it, and it's horrifying. And that's what we've seen. That regime is probably weaker than it has ever been. And the core problem they face, unlike the protests you saw in the past on some other topics, is that they don't have a way to address.
Today, the European Union is joining the pressure on Tehran. Brussels has adopted another package of sanctions targeting individuals and institutions responsible for the repression of the Iranian people and actions destabilizing the region. Importantly, the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is to be added to the list of terrorist organizations alongside Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. Tehran has responded with harsh rhetoric. Iranian military commanders warn that any attack on Iran will be met with an immediate response targeting American interests throughout the Middle East. Iran also emphasizes that it will not bow to military or sanctions pressure and is seeking allies. A mural with an unambiguous message has been unveiled in the capital. He who sows the wind shall reap the whirlwind. The threat of military force would destabilize the entire region, especially given the nature of the US presence in the Middle East. In my opinion, this is a common belief in the region. The countries of the region strongly oppose military threats because there is a broad consensus that such destabilization would pose serious challenges for the entire Middle East. That is why the countries of the region oppose this scenario. At the same time, behind the tough geopolitics lies a human tragedy. Iran is still struggling with the consequences of the bloody protests and brutal repression. Human rights organizations speak of thousands of victims, mass arrests, and show trials intended to intimidate the public. However, isolated voices coming out of Iran show the extent of frustration and fatigue with the regime. It's been 20 days. We have no information from the outside world. We don't know what has happened in our city or in the whole country. We have been completely cut off from the people we know, including those who live outside Iran. The Middle East is becoming one of the key pieces of a puzzle that involves not only Tehran and its nuclear program, but also the United States' ability to project power and control several crises at once. The movements of the US fleet, the decisions of the European Union, and the increasingly harsh statements from Washington and Tehran show that tensions will continue to rise. The real question mark remains the scale of this confrontation and whether it will lead to forced talks or the use of force.